November 6th meeting of the Tupelo Planning Committee. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. At this time, please rise for the invocation given by Pam Hadley and pledged by Patty Thompson.
Our Father in heaven, dear Lord, we thank you, Lord, for this day. Lord, thank you for this committee, Lord, for the city that we live in, Lord. We just pray that you'll just continue to guard our hearts and mind, Lord, as we do the business of the city, Lord. We just pray that you'll just be with our meeting, just be with all that we do. We just pray, Lord, that you just continue to bless us and keep us in your care and help us to bless you by serving others. We do thank you. We pray this prayer in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Please face the flag. Attention. Salute. Pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The Tupelo Planning Committee is a volunteer group appointed by the mayor and approved by the city council. We receive no compensation for this as we do it as a community service. We spend a lot of time in our own funds studying and researching the application and visiting the sites that are on our agenda each month. At this time, I would ask the staff and committee members to introduce themselves.
Tanner Newman, Director of Development Services.
Jenny Safely, City Planner.
Bentley Nolan.
Pam Hadley.
Lindsay Leak.
Leslie Martin.
Victor Fleitas.
Patty Thompson.
Scott Davis. Russ Wilson, Zoning Administrator.
Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes of the last meeting?
Make a motion we accept them as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please raise your right hand. Unanimous. Jeannie, do we have a report on council actions?
No council actions on old business. The text amendments for tonight will be reviewed at tomorrow's council meeting at 6 o'clock at the North Church Street Elementary School.
Did the last, did he appeal the decision, the Easterl Foster, from the last meeting?
He did not appeal. They've decided to wait on maybe some zoning changes.
Okay.
Any report on new business?
Well, on old business, it's just because we've had this exciting moment and I don't want to pass it by. We have been waiting. TA 2202 has been in legal review. The proposals from Planning Committee from last July are in a variation in the text amendments that we are reviewing tonight.
So does that mean we have to pull something off the table? Do we have to? No.
No, those weren't on the table because that was a committee action that wasn't a proposal for a vote.
Okay, thank you.
Just a recommendation, rather.
I'll skip over the new applications for being reviewed. And we'll just go straight on to the first item of the agenda, TA 2301.
Yes. So relative to the 2202, where the original suggestion of Planning Committee was to review our multifamily housing standards so that our by right was more regulated, more controlled, to add in more compatibility and flexibility, which was the essential intent, I think, of the recommendation of committee. So the 2301 specifically is related to housing. What this does is standardize many of our uses in a way that allows us more regulatory oversight to ensure that the design and the best practices and the site plan of the developments are in compliance with quality of life, health, safety, and the growth we're looking at for housing in the city. So this standardizes multifamily use and recodifies the zones, the types of multifamily use, duplexes, the multifamily 3 to 8 unit, 9+, townhouses, single family, accessory dwellings, where those are permitted and their type of allowed use. Congregate living, we have redefined that to more solidly adhere to building code, Mississippi Department of Health, and HUD standards specifically, but have also included the regulations by other licensing agencies to make sure we're capturing that not only in our definition, but in the standards of use for congregate living facilities. We've also codified those. Multifamily housing developments, so any multifamily unit use, so single structure, if there's more than one structure, we've created standards for what that kind of development looks like relative to open space and walkability, proximity to traffic patterns. We've also included shelter standards. So we have currently no definition for temporary shelter in our code, emergency shelters for unsheltered individuals. And so we've looked at that and really standardized some best practices that are legal for us to standardize in the sense of ensuring that we have case management plans, we have length of stay plans with our shelters. Not necessarily what those plans are, but that they have them and those are on record with the city, that our homeless resource network and also police are aware of the procedures. Also part of those shelter standards, multifamily and congregate, is the requirement to register as a rental unit, which allows our building inspectors to inspect those units on a regular basis because there is human habitation at a location, whereas a business is making money off of that. We want to just make sure we have oversight. And as part of that, we've also codified our rental standards outside of the code of ordinances, just to ensure that rental is being processed through our office correctly. This also includes a requirement for short-term rentals, which is anything under a 30-day stay, to register as a rental unit. This also requires all rental units have a lease agreement on file. We recognize that that's not going to be something that's always signed. People register their units prior to occupancy, but a signed agreement identical to that presented to the Department of Development Services would need to be available when requested by the department for the occupied tenant. And then relative to those, just definition changes, some sort of base zoning use changes that allows for the capacity of those developments and areas, some dimension changes relative to our setbacks, and off-street parking requirements here. In order to accommodate better land use, we're looking at no longer requiring, except in high intensity, high uses, that there be a minimum parking requirement for developed parking. Trying to encourage shared parking agreements, trying to encourage lack of sort of our concrete island sort of scenario, and allow our commercial developers to define with us, with a limit, what their parking needs are. So that is 2201 in a nutshell. I can get more detailed if the committee has questions, seeing that we have
2301.
in 2301, my apologies.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
The new requirements for monitoring or requiring rental units to provide certain information to the city.
Mhm.
Is this going to begin with new applications or existing rental places grandfathered in? How exactly is that going to be implemented?
Sure, it's a good question. So every rental unit in the city is required to get a rental registration and license on an annual basis by October 1st. So that would come into effect annually. They will have to present that information as part of their registration and licensing.
Much like a business does with their certificate of occupancy.
Exactly, yes.
Every year, and that's beginning October 1, 24.
All of our rental units, that's standardized, that every
So it
CO
already exists.
expires on October 1, that's right.
Gotcha. Or should be, every rental unit should be.
Not necessarily re-inspected then, but re-registered.
Yes,
correct?
in terms of
Yes.
the registration.
That's right.
So this is not new in terms of the registration.
No, not at all, not at all.
But there is a difference with respect to the requirement for the lease agreement
Yes.
and some form of information about the manner of the rental of the unit.
That's right, and the lease agreement is primarily because the only safety protection for landlords or tenants in the state of Mississippi is the Landlord-Tenant Act,
Sure.
which essentially says that the law upholds whatever lease agreement you have in place. Without a lease agreement, there's no protection for anyone.
And that if there is not a written lease agreement, there's a form that the city provides where the requisite information is supposed to be placed there?
We are working with HUD and really to make sure that we have a template that's available if people want to use that for a lease agreement, just as standardized, but to make sure that some of those, if say you have a subsidized housing unit, there are different requirements in that lease. So we want to make sure that language is available to people, but we don't have a standardized that is required.
Understood. And the reason I say is that, as I understand Mississippi law, there is not a requirement for a written lease agreement.
That's correct.
And so if some do, but those who don't, and you still are required to provide this information, I just wondered if there was some template form that they would fill out in lieu of submitting a copy of the lease.
No, we have not allowed that variation.
There may need to be some consideration for that, though.
Because you're gonna have two classes of landlords, those who go, a long-term, month-to-month, 30-day permissible residential
yes.
rent. And you've got those, because there's no requirement for writing in the Mississippi law, the statute of frauds for any contracts not exceeding 15 months.
Fair enough.
Mississippi is actually different than other states. It's 12 in every other state but ours. It's 15 here. So you can have an oral lease agreement with any tenant, and it is legally binding, the same as a written lease agreement. But you're going to have two categories of landlords, those with written, those with not. Those who don't should be required, if you have the others providing information, to provide the requisite basic data that the others do.
That's fair, yeah.
So let's talk about that, because this is the first time that specific issues come up.
I'm just bringing up some old first-year property law.
Which need to be, yeah, true, need to be discussed. Is there maybe a form that we could have the tenant complete, where they sign acknowledging that they are entering, to this agreement without a written agreement? Something for our documentation on the city side that at least acknowledges, hey, there is no written agreement, and the tenant understands that.
Well, I think the easiest thing to do is to put the obligation on the landlord who has the registration requirement. And that as part of their responsibility to submit either the lease or equivalent, they would submit the form, right, with the requisite information signed by them, and then get their tenant to sign it every year.
That's right, yeah, we do have that kind of qualification, but not a specific form.
I'm just saying it
No,
might be.
that's a really good point.
It might be easy to have a template form that you're checking boxes as opposed to getting, folks to have to work something of their own out.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it in terms of trying to encourage participation and doing it by
Yeah.
making it as easy as possible and making sure that we're not treating landlords differently based on whether they have traditionally used written lease agreements or oral.
That's absolutely fair, yeah, thank you for that.
So let me ask you this, as we are going through, tonight's objective is to say, yes, we agree with this, or no, we don't, basically.
The objective of the planning committee is to make a recommendation for approval or approval with amendment or disapproval to council for their review.
Okay, so if there are any changes that we think need to be made, we need to do that while we're doing what we're doing up here.
Yes.
Yes.
So is there something as far as the lease that we need to say?
I don't know that it requires amendment to the language. I'm looking at it more from a facilitation
Yeah.
Like an
point of
internal
view at the
process.
point of contact with the landlord and for the city to get the requisite information.
Yeah, a point of process.
Right, when
Yeah.
I read it, I didn't see it as a language issue of the code itself so much as how are we gonna do this practically?
Yeah.
And make sure that we cover all the bases.
And we will do that. That's fantastic.
So on page 17 of the section that we're reviewing, page 17, item 6 up at the top.
Oh, right, yeah, we will change, is that the language you're gonna talk about for short-term rental?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So this we need
Yeah,
to
paragraph
just,
5, yeah, or.
so that's where you were with 5 and 6. We had, in looking at that, as far as the short-term rental that's more than 30 days but less than a year. So are we going to change the verbiage from beginning of the sentence, short-term rental on the third line, all the way
Yes.
down to the end of that section?
Yes, and I'll just say for our viewers at home, there is some complication in the language there, just from my own human poor editing, that doesn't capture the intent of this, which we will clarify, that short-term rental units, which is defined as a rental for 30 days or less, and residential rental units that rent out for less than 6 months per tenant, which are not technically a short-term rental unit, but a registered rental unit, that those are exempt from our requirement that with every new tenant, a new inspection is required. And so in lieu of that, an annual inspection for short-term rentals is what we're codifying. And that's with the I'll change that language, yes.
All right. So basically, the gist of it will be short-term rentals, more than 30 days, less than a year, will be inspected annually.
Correct.
Well, let's back up on paragraph 5, and that's on page 17.
Right, it may need a tweak.
That language is going to need to be tweaked.
It may need a tweak, I agree with Leslie. It will need some kind of tweaking. I think the form probably will take care of 90% of the problem,
Okay,
if one can be figured out.
yeah.
The Housing Law Clinic at the University of Mississippi School of Law is a free resource. I have friends there, they're very helpful,
Okay, thank you.
and maybe have worked with something like this in the past. I'm sure you could get somebody there to.
Okay, so when we make a motion, do we need to just say for that section, verbiage needs to be modified?
I think you can say with modifications to language on, as discussed on, for section 11.12. And we'll reference the minutes for that. So your motion doesn't get too complicated.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
you get where I'm trying to go
Yeah, I
here.
do.
Okay. All right.
Those are great.
Is this where the signs are? Yep. All right, do we have a conversation more about the tables that are shown on pages 3 and 4? 4 in particular, is everything good on that? And I do acknowledge that under Congregant Living 1 for MUR, that we have a by right, but with the asterisk, that does clearly state that in addition to some other verbiage there, by compatibility in mixed use residential where occupancy is more than 8 adults. So no more than 8 adults, am I reading that right? Commercial, non-congregant shelters and residential use with 10 or more occupants permitted only on major collector and arterial streets or MDOT jurisdiction or US highway by compatibility in the MUR where occupancy is more than 8 adults. So that means that by right up from 5 to 8, from 6 to 8 is by right.
Correct.
Anything over that
It's by compatibility.
is by compatibility.
And would have to be on that major collector road.
And it has to be on the
Major
major
or
collector.
arterial road.
Okay, I'm good with that. I appreciate that. I still have a bit of heartburn over the dwelling, duplexes on the table on page 4 being a by right under medium density residential. I strongly believe that they should be at least, by compatibility.
I think you have every right to make that amendment. True.
We had pretty
I would not
active-
oppose that, that's all I'm saying.
We had active discussion before you got here.
Yeah, trying to work through that.
I mean, it does, it gives you a little bit of flexibility in making it by compatibility. It's not discouraging it, it's saying there's an extra layer of,
Oversight.
Oversight.
By right with compatibility is an option.
No.
it would just, be by compatibility would,
By
by compatibility instead of by right.
That's
And because I want to make sure I understand what the proposal would change to if we moved it by right. We would add a level of accountability where at least the project would have to come to us to determine if compatibility, or does it stay at the operational level with you?
It stays, the final decision stays with the Director of Development Services.
Absolutely, okay.
But compatibility requires notice to property owners within 500 feet to a public hearing where there's discussion, and if there is adverse impact relative to health, safety, or property values, that the onus is put on those property owners to demonstrate, then that is how the compatibility determination is made.
But there's still no aesthetic oversight
No.
included in that.
That's right.
And I get that. But at least that there would be a little something, something.
So I would take it then that the request would be to move it from R to C on the chart.
If that were, if you were to make that recommendation, that would need to be stated in the motion.
Does anybody else have questions, comments about that? I mean, I can't be the one person that says, yeah, it needs to be there.
No, I told you, I thought it was a good
Yeah,
idea.
he said he thought it was a good
I think
idea.
that the aesthetic part has to be handled in the overlay.
Yes.
But I thought it was a good idea, because when I was in Joyner, I lived 2 houses down from one, and they were in and out all the time. I mean, that's just a duplex. I would much have preferred it to be a house.
Yeah.
I understand by right.
Jenny is
I'm just
Jenny's up
saying,
there
y'all get
saying-
to decide what your recommendation is by vote.
My concern, and I think it arises from Jenny's point earlier, was for my ground level view and what I see, I continue to have an abiding concern with the city being open and amenable to opportunities for renters to find housing, because I'm concerned of strangling our service industry and making sure that young people have a place where they can set up and move forward. But
I don't think that by changing that to compatibility, that it would impact them.
I agree, and I
It's
think
not
that's
a
the
ban,
reason
we're
why.
not banning
No,
it.
no, agreed,
It's more of
agreed.
a, let's just make sure that this street, or this block is the right one. Not even neighborhood, it might be in the neighborhood, just not that spot, so.
I will say that currently in our code, duplexes and medium density residential are by flexibility, so by compatibility is still more generous than our current code.
Oh, so we're changing it from something that was a
More
little more
restrictive.
rigid, more restrictive.
So that's, and you go, I mean, think about it this way, go back to the Flowerdale matter, where that was a use by right, and, there were many that felt that tied the committee's hands on what you were able to do. Just remember that when it comes to this matter. I mean,
I don't want our hands tied where we don't have anything to say on where these duplexes are going.
I think,
We're talking about an individual Duplex.
a single,
Well, with two,
Structure.
you know. But we-
single structure with 2 units.
Yeah, but, yeah, so that is different than what we had last month.
So if you were to go compatibility, to Jenny's point, it would be more generous than the current code, but it would also still create or allow that oversight to ensure, like Scott said, on a case-by-case basis, hey, is that appropriate on this parcel, in this
So-
neighborhood?
If it, by being compatible, and if we think as a committee, nope, that's not, we can say no, and that would be a no, right? Or is that
Compatibility would-
different than flexibility?
Compatibility would be held in the department level, flexibility would bring it to the committee. So if we were
Okay.
to approve a duplex in-house, say, and a neighbor appealed that, it would be appealed to the planning committee.
That's right.
It would only come to us
The
for
notices
appeal.
go out to the property owners within 500 feet, so really the adjacent neighbors are deciding what's coming next to them.
So how does that work then? You send out to all the neighbors within 500 feet. And if they're in an uproar, they all got to show up at your office individually? There's no set
They
meeting
can
time?
We take
call, they can call, they can text, they can email, and that'll be made a part.
But we do have a hearing, just like you have the planning committee hearings, we have in-house hearings, we just schedule them routinely.
Sure.
Yeah.
It takes it away from us down to the administrative,
Less.
executive level where you guys can adjudicate it, determine it.
Just
and-
less strenuous.
And only comes to us on an appeal, as opposed to before, with
It would only come
flexibility,
to you.
initiating and always coming to us.
Yeah, which is a preventative.
I can live with it. It's
Yeah.
lessening up the standard, which I think we need, and it provides a
Meeting in the
measure of
middle.
oversight.
Kind of meeting in the middle there.
Yeah, I can live with that.
Yeah, I'll
Sounds
live
fine.
with that. All right, so what section is that on a little, so does the table have a,
Yes, it is table 4.3. And to be fair, in your draft here, as you guys know, in our base zoning districts, those uses are listed out. The table form is the more accessible form of those uses. The final, as presented to council, will have that long arduous list, but
Will
Same,
the-
same.
Will the code amendment include the charts though?
it'll include the charts and the list. Yes, sir.
Yeah, because it should be in there.
That's right.
It's helpful.
okay, so table 4.3, page 4, change dwelling, comma duplex to C instead of R, right?
You gotta specify the zone.
C being compatibility.
And
Yeah,
MDR,
MDR.
Oh, thank you.
to C from R in MDR.
Okay.
This is just something I noticed on the attached, if you go allow uses by zone, the attached dwelling unit was not allowed in NUE, and now it's gonna be a right for a single family. How do you go from not allowed at all to a right in that mixed-use employment zone?
Which use are you talking, a detached
A
dwelling?
detached dwelling, which is a single family.
Right.
It is not, you're not allowed, period, in NUE 1 or 2.
Right.
And then now it's gonna be a use by right.
So if you, many of our mixed use, so mixed use employment is intended to be both residential and commercial, right? The employment mixed with the residential. And right now in existing, we have approved subdivisions and mixed use employment zones. If you think on like north of McCullough and south of McCullough, right, all of that has single family. So to a degree, making where some of that residential spread out, we could stay in line with the existing development, but also diversify some of our housing
A good
options.
example would be Flowerdale, where Flowerdale is located, that's MUE. You would be able to, they would have been able to build a neighborhood there, a single family neighborhood there.
But it makes sense, it was just, after I started looking at the rest of the chart,
Right.
going from not allowed at all to a right,
Yeah, it's different.
you know, I missed that the first one.
What do we?
Well, so why is that not compatible then?
It is, but how do you mean?
Are you talking about congregate living one, or are you talking?
No, no, no.
I'm
I'm talking
talking
about
about
single
a single
family.
family, I had just noticed when I was just checking with,
Yes.
that it was not,
Single-family
this is
residential,
a,
it makes
on the
sense.
old, it used to be called detached dwelling. And an NUE was not allowed, period. But on the new one, which is now called single-family residential unit, it's a use by right in NUE 1 and 2.
I
And
will
I just
note,
noticed that was quite a change from not being allowed to being a right.
but only on major collector and only
Yeah,
on local
yeah,
roads,
yeah,
local
yeah.
roads, that's right. So to make sure those local roads are kind of more protected where the commercial development is on the major, yeah.
It's incorporated into single-family residential use.
That was a name change.
Yeah,
from detached
But to
dwelling.
protect that accessory dwelling unit kind of idea.
Okay, not when you looked at the table that's on page 3?
Yes, if you follow detached dwelling unit over to MUE 1 and 2, it's not allowed, period. Now, the detached dwelling unit is called single-family unit now, and it's a use by right. I just noticed it, I just thought I'd ask the
Yeah,
question,
it's a good
because
question.
that was a big change from not being
With the
allowed.
limit being on a local road
Yes,
only, and then by flexibility if it's somewhere else.
yes, which I think is reasonable. I see your explanation for that.
All right, am I looking at this right? The table that is shown on page 3, that's the old one, that's
That's
going away.
correct, old one.
Okay.
Freak it
I was
out.
like, oh my gosh, did I miss a whole table?
It's old on one page and new on the other, so just caught myself flipping back and forth between those. Sorry, I didn't mean to get off
No,
track.
great question.
Yeah.
I'll say one
So-
thing.
Help me understand something.
All right, so in regional commercial, RC, as far as townhouses, we don't have those listed as any type of usage. Sorry, I just realized that, but when we have multifamily that's allowed in RC, you know, why would you not have a townhouse development that would also be allowed, at least by compatibility or flexibility?
For functional purposes, as far as quality of life needs, townhouses are often more in line with single-family residential. It's a little too high-intensity use of an area for your typical townhouse development. But that's definitely reasonable to think about it if by compatibility or flexibility there to give people the opportunity.
In which,
In LDRs?
In
Yeah.
regional commercial,
RC.
which is the mall area.
Oh,
Because if you have multifamily, 9+ units allowed in RC, I could see a scenario where you might have a townhouse development that would be considered.
so can we put that as compatibility? To give us a little more flexibility, or F?
Might even need to be, I would say compatibility or flexibility, one of the two. But I think we need to at least create the opportunity for it and not block it altogether.
Yeah, that's fair.
How about if we go rigid and then we can always lessen up next time?
and this is for the development of both townhouses, or only townhouses, or single-family and townhouses?
Only townhouses.
Only townhouses in RC,
That's right.
which is the mall district.
Why
And I'm
would you
assuming
not
that there's some
do,
property there amenable to it?
That's why I think it needs to be flexibility or compatibility. That way you have the authority to say yes or no, just depending on if it's the right, if it's a good proposal and it makes sense on a case-by-case basis, giving it that flexibility option would allow you to make that determination. And if it's not a good proposal, then you say no.
Yeah, it seems like there's an opportunity there because a lot of times you get these like large multifamily complexes and they'll have like a row of townhouses or something, or like an adjacent townhouse little like side. development or something like that. I could see that
Yeah,
developing out there.
certainly.
So by not having upper story residential, does that only apply to residential, or does that apply to somebody that might have a business downstairs and a house upstairs, and living quarters upstairs?
That, it,
Yes, if it's, you can
Yes.
say upper story, so if you
yeah,
think of
So-
downtown, you have, say if you had reached department store, first floor, and then apartments above it.
Yeah.
Main
So
attraction.
from that standpoint, should we, under RC, not have a flexible use or compatibility
I don't-
for the upper story?
I don't want us to get too overly residential in regional commercial, because I need you to, I need us all to remember that regional commercial specifically, it's oriented toward high-level vehicular use, and you don't want to create
Bottleneck.
too much density in your residential or too much overlap between your commercial and residential. So the mixed use of commercial and residential on a single site is gonna conflict with the quality of life for the person living in that. Whereas if you have a dedicated, here's a residential development, that has the ability for us to buffer, for us to create walkable transitions. But upper story residential kinda, you're definitely gonna have more than quality of life would recommend.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I was just thinking of that open space that's undeveloped, back behind, the new Firestone that's out at the mall next to,
All the Scruggs property out there.
all the Scruggs property that's out there. So, you know, if you're thinking about how that land is gonna be developed, what is all of that land? Isn't all of that the,
Currently, I think it's agricultural.
It is
Yeah, it's
agricultural,
agricultural.
it's an
which
upland
we
zone.
know, but we know
Rezone.
the inner part of that is not flood zone.
That's right,
And that's what's gonna be developed.
yeah.
And so when we think about that, what are we doing to manage how that's being developed?
Most of that will be RC probably, the start.
It'll be commercial, yeah,
Yeah.
and that'll
And I'm
need to be
assuming
right
it-
on that, right at that, all of that intersection. You know, I think when we were looking at townhouses and multifamily, the ideal is to think about that east of 45 and along Barnes Crossing extended a little farther out from the core of all of that commercial.
On the side roads
On the
that
side
are
roads.
underutilized.
That's right,
To
and
some
that
extent.
vehicular traffic can't support so much anyway.
I'm sorry, I had a question based on what Leslie was asking. I'm assuming that if there were any intents in the future, that it would come to us through a request for a zoning change.
Yes.
So, I mean, that process is built in and exists already. And this, I may be thinking too far ahead. This is a major revision of the code, and I assume this is gonna be the blueprint for the city for the next 20, 25 years.
Yes, a lot of what comprehensive plan, our current comprehensive plan is not codified. And so the standards and goals and future development of our existing comprehensive plan, this implements a lot of those standards.
Well, I guess if RC had to be something else at some future unimaginable date, if you told me when I was a kid and looked forward to the Sears catalog every year coming to the house, that there would not be a Sears one day, I'd have been knocked over with the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think nationally, there are some issues with the viability of malls long-term. I'm not trying to, cast a
Sure.
negative eye on anything, Lord knows. But it is a major economic trend nationally that we have to recognize. I'm assuming that, if the worst were to happen, not hoping that it happens, that at some point, the zoning process and appeals and requests to the city would address any concerns that arose.
Yeah.
All right, that's all I need to know.
So are we going to look at townhouses as a flexibility, or are we just going to leave it blank? What's
I
your
feel like
thoughts?
it cannot hurt to create the opportunity, but I'm not at all suggesting we allow it by right. I feel like to cover our bases and make sure we're not backing ourselves as a city into a corner, we need to create a mechanism to where it could be allowed if it met, if it made sense, if it met the criteria that the committee found under that specific request that it made sense. So I would suggest making townhouses a flexibility in RC, so that if you were to have a multifamily development at some point proposed there, the townhouses would be at least something they could consider, and not just an apartment complex.
And those can be larger lots out there too. When you get to say 500 feet on compatibility, you're only talking 3 or 4 lots around it, so you wouldn't have as much oversight on that as it would be as coming forth from.
I'm sorry, Leslie, you go.
I was just thinking, like, if you've ever been to the Woodlands, just outside of Houston, Texas. So they have a lot of commerce, shops and stuff, but embedded with all of that is a lot of living. So that the people who are living, it's a much more walkable area. And so that's why I was wondering about that upper story residential in the RC zones. Maybe doing that more flexibility kind of thing to at least open up a different thought process of how we're using that land out there.
So unfortunately, if you think about the Woodlands, all of those are 2-lane narrow roads with sidewalks. It would require major infrastructure changes in a regional commercial for that to be able to be pulled off. And I think in maybe some development peripherally, the regional commercial zone is not huge, right? I mean, it doesn't go much past Scruggs to the east and the west side, the back side of Sam's. And so there's not enough opportunity for reuse of land development to narrow those roads and make it make sense. But I totally hear where you're coming from, which is really like for what you're talking about, why townhouses we've put as a use by right in those mixed use employment and in those mixed use commercial corridors and mixed use residential, because those roadways are already so narrow, and it allows for that kind of walkable commercial denser residential development, if that makes sense.
I'm guessing the townhouse development, or theoretical development, would be somewhat insular with access to the major thoroughfare.
That's right. Yeah, you would want it to be protected.
Okay, so we could always, if it turns out there's some big development, different thought, potentially some of that area could be rezoned.
They can propose, any development can propose a rezoning,
Right.
for certain, for sure.
I get, and look, I'm thinking out loud a lot right here on this, but I hear Leslie's point about upper story residential, and I'm not at all suggesting we make this a use by right. But I also propose the question for all of us to think about: what is the harm in making it a use by flexibility? In doing so, essentially what you're doing is creating the opportunity that down the road, if there were to be an instance where it made sense, and this committee ruled that it made sense, then at least there's a mechanism in place to allow that. Otherwise, as it's currently written, no matter what scenario existed, it would not be an allowed use.
So I only say this, I'm not meaning to conflict with any of you guys, but there is a risk in our uses. You want to create spaces where those uses thrive. And if you allow it too broadly, you don't create, okay, this is where I can do this, because this is where we should concentrate that kind of use. And not that a use by flexibility would kind of go against that, but the reason a lot of these are not allowed in certain areas is because you don't want to spread yourself too thin. And then you lose your entire growth idea for an area. These are very area centric.
The flip side, it's because we do want it in certain areas.
Exactly.
So for example, downtown.
Yeah, like look
Main
at
Street
that.
area, those areas where you have commercial develop, where you have businesses.
Right.
And it's the old school, old city, shop on the first floor, residential on the second.
That's right. And you don't
Which
want to
doesn't
spread
work
that out
everywhere.
too much. It doesn't work everywhere. And I mean, it could reasonably be made to work everywhere if there was an entire area revitalization and different growth pattern, but we want to control it more than that. We're allowed to provide incentives and controls.
Old Roby's was like that, wasn't it, when it was a grocery store? When it was still a grocery store, they used to have that two-story
did.
structure, did they not?
Oh,
Or am I
yeah, there's an
imagining?
apartment upstairs.
Yeah,
He lived up there, the owner did.
Yeah, sure did, I remember that when I first moved here. So sort of something like along those lines, but it is kind of limited in terms, it's not something you're gonna build new, probably.
That's right.
So explain to me again what the definition is of a townhouse.
A single structure with no fewer than 3 units separated by firewalls.
Okay, so right now, under MDR, townhouse is by right. And if we are going.
A single one, just one.
3 units,
Yeah.
but we're already changing dwelling duplexes to a compatibility, and townhouses needs to be the same.
That's reasonable.
You guys see that?
And why
Because
not, no, I'm saying, why allow 3 if you don't allow 2?
Right, that's
Right.
my point.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems to be pretty clear.
yep.
Now I see dwelling, multifamily, 3 to 8 unit, MDR by compatibility. Am I missing duplex?
Duplex, it
There it is.
says dwelling.
Dwelling duplex, got it.
I would say we also.
Yeah, I thought we had that moving to compatibility
We
already.
do for the
Right here,
dwelling, but not the
townhouse.
townhouse. Now we're gonna change the
To win.
townhouse as well.
We can do that.
If the duplex was gonna be compatible at 2, then why should the townhouse be right at 3?
Sure,
That's fair enough.
that's understandable.
Yeah.
It's consistent.
And that's under MDR, is that correct?
Yes.
That's fair.
All right. We never did, how do you guys feel about townhouses in RC? Do you want to put an F in there? Do you want to leave it nothing, saying, no, you can't do it?
I thought we decided on making it flexible.
Okay?
I think you wanted the more stringent.
Yeah.
Fine with that. Either way would have been okay.
Okay, so then we're going to change that to F. In RC. And this is really an add F. Okay. I didn't have any other comments. Is somebody else?
I did not. That's all good.
Is the committee ready to make a motion?
Oh, is that what we have to do on each?
On each one, that's right.
Okay. Do you want me to do this?
Yes, please.
You've been taking great notes.
Yeah, all right, so this is for, I'd like to make a motion on proposed text amendment for TA 23-01 to approve with the following changes. Section 11.12.6 to be, change the verbiage so that we have short-term residential, more than 30 days or less than a year will be inspected annually. Section 11.12, Section 5, the verbiage needs modification and refer to the meeting minutes of what should be included. Table 4.3 on page 4, change dwelling duplex to C, compatible from R in the MDR. Change townhouse to C, compatible from R in MDR. And add F for flexibility in RC, also for the townhouse.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, please raise your right hand. Unanimous? Well done.
You guys are troopers. Well done.
This is that alligator too.
There we go, there we go.
All right, pressing forward, we'll now look at TA 23-02
2302 is related to Chapter 10 sign regulations. This primarily reformats that chapter for user friendliness and also regulates off-premises signs such as billboards and off-site electronic display signs. We've also added a section to standardize public artwork and a process for how that can be applied for and how it's regulated. We've included a few updates on design standards for signs relative to height and base of our monument signs and our off-premises signs. We have modified our definition of abandoned signs to 12 months to 3 months if it's been abandoned. And also modified our sign dimensions, the location on the lot primarily that they cannot be located in a parking area. They would need to be on a landscaped area. And our distance requirements, for example, currently billboards can be no closer than 1,500 feet from one another. We've increased that to 1,750 feet distance. And again, I'll just open up for questions as the committee has reviewed and we have no public comment.
So Jenny, under 10.2.1 for the definition of artwork, was there anything in here about, do we have to have code for painting a fire hydrant?
So what that would be considered, how we're going to think about that is that all public artwork, other artistic media, we're gonna let that live, that there. However, it would have to go through the same process, which is just applying as an accessory use. In that case, that would include regulation by the fire department in the city because that's on the right of way. But the real crux in public artwork is that it can be defined as a one-of-a-kind piece of art. And that it's not a sign. Essentially, that is the only regulatory from a First Amendment standpoint abilities that were allowed in public artwork. This just helps us give a standard to incentivize it and to control some of what the artwork is in relation to health and safety and its distractiveness to drivers.
Okay.
Can I ask a question on that? Just about artwork as a background on the sign, that has come up at one time on something. I don't know if there's a way to delineate between that.
Yeah, I think where the face of the advertisement is, what is beyond that, if it is not directly related to the commercial use, so say it's flowers and they're a pawn shop, then that is not part of the sign because it's not related to the business being handled on site. There's a condition for that.
The distinction is,
But if it's part of like a large part of the background of that has a lettering over that, mostly it comes up with some trouble in deciding what is the sign. If the artwork is a different color than that, and then they place their sign over that and say the whole thing is artwork, the whole front of the building can be attracting attention.
Right, yeah, and we've got percentage requirements in here and distinctiveness where the mural, or like for a mural example, would need to be identified as a piece of artwork and not as part of the sign. Mm-hmm.
Jenny, was there any changes or has anything been addressed for construction signs?
Construction signs. Okay, this is an amendment from what you guys have previously seen. So from a First Amendment standpoint for temporary signs, the rule of thumb is if you have to read it to determine if it is in compliance, then you have broken the First Amendment in this way. So essentially all temporary signs we have regulated by a size, a required time, a location standard. And said if you are trying to propose a larger sign or a different kind of location, then that has to be reviewed with a variance. So essentially, Leslie, to your point, if a construction sign was outside of the size allowance for a temporary sign, then it would not be in compliance with the temporary sign code, and it would have to be regulated as a permanent sign.
So typically our construction signs are 4x8s, because it's a piece of plywood
Mm-hmm.
that is used to do that. Sometimes they do bigger,
Mm-hmm.
a little bigger, but they are temporary because they're on wood posts in the ground.
That's right.
Um,
So that would be
So-
allowed if it's less than 32 square feet,
what is,
then,
what's the size of their?
oh gosh, then if it's there for longer than 3 months, it's
It's
considered a
4 by 8.
permanent sign.
Piece of plywood.
Okay, so 4x8 is the max
Mhm.
that's allowed for a temporary sign.
And no longer than 3 months.
During the period of construction.
It should
It's
be
3
for the
months.
period of construction, because if you've got a big yard, if you've got a big site sign, guarantee that project's gonna be way
So
more than 3
at that
months.
point, they're gonna have to ask for a permit for it, is my point.
There has been some that said, on some temporary sites, that once the first lot is sold or that they get a certificate of occupancy, then it has to
Right.
come down.
And the point from legal is that we can't distinguish based on type of sign. So beyond a particular standard, then we have to say it has to be regulated as a permanent sign, even if it's not in formality permanent.
They can still keep their sign up as long as they come get a permit.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
So can this be part of the building permit application process
So-
for a temporary construction sign specifically?
Usually we get
It could be.
a sign permit
course.
or
Any accessory use, such as a sign.
And then that way, it's just, they get it on the start of the project, and it's there, and then this way you guys can see it, and it's part of that.
Mhm.
Can you require that to be? You know, if if it's over an acre or whatever,
That's reasonable. Get it on the front end.
get it on the front end. Just
Happy to do
let's
that. That makes
eliminate
good
the
sense.
problem.
is it under temporary sign?
Where is that at?
Oh gosh. 10. Been living in the weeds in this too long, guys.
Most of the signs that I see are little small yard signs.
That's
for the-
right.
Most contractors, there's a few that are little bit.
Okay, page 10 of that section. So it is very easy to include that where a temporary sign will be placed longer than the allocated 3-month period
So this, for number 4?
as part of a permitted project. Yeah,
We're
on,
just making this a 7.
yeah, uh-huh.
Is a permit is not required.
As part of a permitted project.
And so we're gonna add a number 7
That's right.
to 10.4.
Sub 7.
So 10.4,
That this must be approved as part of the construction application, of the permitted activities application.
Approved at time of permitted activities.
Mhm.
Is that a construction permit?
maximum 4
It-
4x8,
It'll stay with
32
that,
square feet.
yeah. We can't specify for construction, we're just gonna say for the permitted activity,
Wonder how we know when it was issued then.
as part of the permitted activity, when the activity is permitted.
Any activity.
The construction, like theoretically, the
Well, most permitted
Whatever
activities, they
activity.
may not want any kind of sign. Do you have a check box where you say?
Yeah, like I
"Okay,
can
sign
put that as part of the review of, let's say, for example, construction of a commercial facility, then I'm gonna have this sign here longer than X number of months. Can that be permitted as part of this, just as a check mark
So
in the
the
review?
verbiage there is a permitted activity.
That's right.
Approved at time of permitted activity.
Oh, okay, you take good note, you wanna do that? What did you say?
I said add sub 7 to 10.4.
Okay.
Language approved at time of permitted activity.
And you said we can't specify construction, why?
Because if you have to read it to determine if it is compliant, then you're automatically
In violation of
in
the
violation of the
I'm
First
just
Amendment.
wondering, how do we pick it up then? I don't know when and then we wouldn't know when that 3-month period began or when it should.
Well,
end.
it's already, we recognize if it is where a temporary sign is placed longer than 3 months as part of a permitted activity, then that sign, which would otherwise require a permit because it's outside of the standardized timeline, could be permitted along with whatever activity they need a permit for already.
I just didn't know how we would check that.
Yeah.
On
we'll
the
just include it on the
applications?
application. Yeah.
That they're gonna have a sign.
As an it could be as an accessory use
Or do you put a little checkbox in the next to it, say, do you anticipate putting up a sign?
sign.
And if
Yeah,
they don't,
that's right.
well, we're just gonna be going back and digging through the files to find out. I don't know if there's been a problem or anything we're trying to solve with this or.
Right.
Just the fact that people put up particular kinds of signs for long periods of time. We're trying to control the period of time temporary signs can be up. And this is kind of a hole where for example, all construction is gonna wanna put up a sign. This is who's doing the construction. And so Leslie astutely is trying to make sure that we've captured that on the front end.
Realistically speaking, of course, I've got lots of signs every day, and they honestly don't bother me in the least. 3 months seems like it's short, because a lot of construction takes a good bit longer than 3 months.
Yeah.
Just establishing the data and going back and checking it is
It-
just gonna be a lot of
it's-
backtracking to, I was just wondering,
But I thought the whole point was that you
Just
get, you
check
just
mark.
ask the
Just come
question,
in.
when they get a permit for whatever that
Do
activity.
you need a
is-
sign for more than
Do
3
you
Or
months?
need a
are you going
sign?
to be putting up a sign?
when they check that, do we make a copy of that and put it in a file according to date, so we go back and check
It'll be
it
part of
out?
the
No, you make
construction
them get the
approval,
permit
for
at that
example.
time, the
Yeah,
sign
yeah,
permit at that time.
Yeah.
So this way you don't have to go back and check. Am I missing something?
no,
I guess it never
I
becomes an
think
issue.
it's okay, we'll get it clarified in
It never
process.
becomes an issue unless somebody complains. And I don't imagine you get a lot of,
More than likely, so
I
that's-
imagine that you
that's
don't
why
get
it
a
was
whole lot of
temporary sign.
complaints. Right, is it a permanent solution to a non-existing problem?
Mhm.
Well, right now it's not not
Gotta
a
fill in the
problem because
loopholes.
nobody ever said anything to us. We put up a sign, does anybody bother you for your construction sign?
Sometimes, I mean, if I'm not,
Out in
I just
summer,
have
right
the
here.
little yard signs, I'm not like,
Yeah.
McCarty King putting these massive billboards in front of me.
Billboards, yeah, mobile billboards.
And I will just tell you,
I just got a little
It's
yard.
project dependent.
Yeah,
It's
some projects don't even put it out.
Right, you know,
and
It doesn't if I like the project or not, I like the people, I mean, I want to be, associated with that project, so.
well, and I'll tell you, it's not typically me that would want to do that. It's the people who have donated money
Yeah.
to have those things built. They
I understand.
want to see that stuff and to drum up all that. So this is what I wrote. Add item 7 to say that permitted activities. Now see, even I'm confused.
A temporary sign
approved it.
not meeting the standards for temporary signs may be permitted as part of the activity.
Can I just refer to you?
Refer to the minutes, that's totally,
There you go, refer to the minutes. Thank you.
I know what we mean to do.
Okay, something I was looking in here and I don't see, but it might, maybe when we start looking at is what about using a vehicle, or especially a non-running vehicle with signage on it?
That is already in there, that unless, a vehicle cannot be used for signage unless it is a vehicle that is being used as part of regular activity, is already in
Well,
there.
there's some in town that have not moved in months and months and
It's
months.
not
being
supposed to
used
be
for
parked
signs.
in the front yard or near the
It's
street.
being
if
parked in the
space
front
is-
yard.
We are
It's
working on our code
actually
enforcement.
off-site from where their office is anyway.
Yeah, it's a code enforcement issue, and we're working on
I'm just
it, for sure.
saying.
Sounds like a specific case, though.
Yeah,
Yeah,
wait, that sounds like.
So, on page 5 of this section,
Uh-huh.
you have sign development in progress. This is under, I guess, your definitions. And this, you can tell, specifically refers to our construction signs. Down there at the
Oh,
bottom.
sure. A development in progress sign. Yeah, get that, a
Look at
definition
you.
already in there for this use.
Right, so
So
that
at
would be,
least that's a definition, you just gotta figure out how to
Yeah.
handle it.
Mhm.
that would be the Fair Park Towers 2 project
Yes.
and sign.
Cotton
For
Estates,
example.
it has, had that sign out there for 20 years.
Well, the sign,
It's on,
the square footage is based on the size of the
Yeah,
building.
I view it as a sign of optimism.
Signs just cost so much trouble.
I wish I cared more about them.
Well, it's not,
if it was
Us.
shining in your
it's the
bedroom.
people that,
All right, so Jenny, we have you addressed the candlefoot's
Yes.
rating of these
4,000 Kelvin,
LEDs?
and they have to be shielded.
Okay. I saw somebody put up a new LED, and Lord have mercy, because the background of the sign is white. Wow, it was a little blinding. All right, we defined what a feather sign is, so I understand that.
so is there any more discussion on signs?
Hang on, Scott, I'm just going through my notes. 'Cause I really did read it all. Jenny, so when we talked about 10.3.1 sign area, item number 3,
I need further advice from legal on that one, but I will amend that to be appropriate if it needs changing prior to.
So what is that? I'm sorry.
The confusion that Leslie was having, or that we discussed, and Russ may be able to give better understanding to this, basically that you want, if a sign does not exceed or exceeds 60 degrees, that it may need more than one face, and
that's
we give some-
strictly just for, if you have a two sign, it's counted as one sign if you have two faces that are back to back, like a monument sign. If they're angled at more than 60 degrees.
oh,
that
it
could
needs
be-
two signs.
And then it is
Oh, look at
interpreted
that.
as two signs. On billboards, if the two sides are more than 5 feet apart, they can't be more than 5 feet apart, because you don't want them both facing a street, because then you've exceeded the 400 square foot minimum, or maximum rather. So there has to be some distance requirement to keep people from doing creative things and getting more signs, and saying, well, I've got both sides facing the street. But that doesn't work.
as long as you guys understand that, because I read that and I did not understand it.
That makes sense to me what Russ is saying. Yeah.
It's just,
Okay, so you guys are good with that one?
got a guy that did that out on McCullough Boulevard, at a new pool place out there. He wanted to put both sides of his sign facing one way, and it ends up he's exceeding the limit because we have a way to determine that they are too far apart to count as one sign with two faces. So it's just a limit to keep people from saying, I don't put both faces up that way. It just
Yeah.
makes it a larger sign.
That makes sense.
All right, there was at one point a conflict between, on 10.3.5, items 6 and 7. This was the placement of the curb line versus properties. And we were at 6 and 7, and I see now that there's an 8. And that didn't have anything to do with it.
Can I
So-
mention something on that?
Yes, please.
Not every area of the city has a 15-foot setback. The property line or the right-of-way can be 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, but you want the signs at a minimum of 15 feet off the street. So they're off the right-of-way, but they need to be at least 15 feet back in order to be consistent and leave side angles right there. There are some areas in the city where there is no right-of-way, like downtown, but that's a different animal.
So then, she's not throwing us out again, is
We
she?
just need to move on. We need to keep going. So those are not in conflict. They just capture
Sorry.
different things. It's okay.
So does that make sense on that?
Yes, that makes sense. So that's where the conflict I was coming from here. So on 6, it says that, where it has 15 feet from curb line, street edge, or driveway. But then when you come down to 7, it says 5 feet.
But that's from the property line. The property line and the curb line are not always the same. That's why there's distinctions between the two.
And
So-
sometimes if you've got a 20-foot right-of-way and then that sign needs to be 5 more feet back from the property line. So right-of-way goes from.
Right.
All right, so are you guys saying there is no
There's no
conflict here?
conflict.
There's no-
Okay, that was for you guys to understand, because I don't really understand it. That was fine. Because I'm thinking, the property line versus that, it doesn't matter. I think that was the last thing I had on that.
Curb line, right of way, easement, and then,
Yeah, the curb and
The property line.
and the property line's not the same.
yeah, they're not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird.
The right-of-way could go into their property. or
Correct.
less. But I did have something over there, Jenny, when I had mentioned that about 12-foot height on signs.
Yeah, let's address that. We gotta move through this, guys. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cut off conversation, but we gotta have,
So what are we?
we're at
finished up
signs.
signs,
We
I
just
think.
finished up signs.
So do we have anything on signs? Are we approving it as it stands?
Just with that addition of that 7th point.
All right, so you want me to do?
Please do.
I make a motion that we approve the sign ordinance, I make a motion that we approve the proposed text amendment for TA 23-02, Chapter 10 sign regulations with the following comment. For section 10.4, adding item number 7, which will be additional verbiage that Jenny Savory will pull from the meeting minutes.
Will do.
Beautiful. We have a motion and a second.
I second.
All in favor, raise your hand. Unanimous. All right. Moving ahead to TA 2303,
Where's that at?
Development Code,
Right there at the back.
at the very back.
Huh?
So this is an amendment to just a section on subdivisions, and this adds in really a more strenuous approval process. There are a few walkability standards and development agreement requirements prior to the final approval of the development in order to continue to subdivision construction. But essentially, this makes every element of subdivision, the subdivision from plat to acceptance of infrastructure for city maintenance, have required approval by our departments and by council in order for us to have a more manageable process through that. This is really a process item.
Question real quickly. Will we an intermediary step in that process for all subdivisions, or will it go from the executive office, the city, to directly to city council?
The planning committee always gets approval on major subdivision preliminary plats. And so at that point, the preliminary plat and the continuation of the process with the development agreement goes to council.
Understood.
And let me just add this for the record, the main part here that we're trying to correct is the acceptance of city streets. And so we've had an issue where in the final plat, where the city clerk accepts that, signs it, and it becomes part of their, it's recorded at the courthouse. Under some of those final plats, there's language that the streets are accepted upon the city clerk's signature. We want to avoid that because we don't want
We don't want to be stuck with the streets, which many
Are not
developers
finished.
have
So now the city
done in the
council,
past.
now the council will have to individually accept those streets instead of it being accepted by a city employee And again, sometimes creating a situation where we don't know that they're a city street.
Understood.
We did make a few changes to minor subdivisions.
Yeah, those need to go through an approval process, and they'll be required to have approval before they can be recorded as a plat through our office.
Do those go to the city council as well? or
No,
only
that's all,
major goes?
it's all internal because it's fewer than 5 lots. 5 lots or fewer.
All right. And so major is defined as greater than 5 lots.
That's right, but it does require major subdivision review if infrastructure is developed.
Sewer, water,
That's right,
electrical,
streets. Mhm.
streets.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. And approval for the streets issue then would be vested solely in the city council. As opposed to
It would,
being done
but
as a-
as, it would have to, in order for city council to even get that item for review, a certificate of final completion would need to be submitted by the city engineer after review by all required utilities and departments.
Understood. All right.
Got it locked up.
Where'd it go? Something about walkability, where did it just go? Come on, sidewalks.
You're looking at,
Here it is, pedestrian circulation.
mm-hmm.
So have we made any changes to make certain that we are providing sidewalks?
That's right, that's what this does, because previously, we just have in here, if you have sidewalks, page 4 of 15, that you have to present that on the plat. This requires that the sidewalks that it requires sidewalks.
Right.
And
Section
removes the payment in lieu of sidewalk option.
121010, that's section number 3. What do you mean that removes payment in lieu of
We have in
sidewalk?
our code, where commercial development, including subdivisions, instead of developing out sidewalks, can essentially pay for the cost per foot of that development into a city fund. And rather than permitting that, we want sidewalks. No option out.
Awesome, good job,
Mhm.
thank you. Yay.
Any further discussion? Questions?
So does this have in here the part about minimum green space?
That's in the base zoning code,
Not this thing?
not this section, no.
Okay.
I'll make a motion to approve, text amendment 23-03.
I'll say.
Motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Unanimous? Very good. December meeting. Work session November 27th, 3rd floor, City Hall.
3rd floor.
Okay. Regular meeting, December the 4th.
Presumably here, if council is completed by then, we'll do that.
What's on the agenda?
Right now,
More of this.
no, we have a site plan for a multifamily development
And the cell tower.
and a cell tower.
No, tip the brag.
All right, what about the work session for December?
It's November the 27th.
27.
It's right there, number 4.
What about the work session for January, which is Christmas Day?
Oh, we will not have to work.
Y'all can have it. I'm not coming. I'm not coming.
Yeah, we would.
I'll be here.
I'm just
I
raising
won't.
that up here.
Anyway.
So Christmas is on a Monday this year, so that affects our work session and the actual meeting itself.
I'll make a
Yeah, I'll get
motion
that
that
one
we
good.
look at that later.
I will resubmit before then changes to the January meeting. Or and work session.
And I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
And I second that.
I do want us to put a little bit of fire underneath everything so that we don't get in trouble.